37 seconds after Trump mocked Ibrahim Traoré in front of millions on live television, the entire room fell into dead silence. No one, not even Trump himself, expected that a young black man from a forgotten nation could make power tremble with just one sentence. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The sun hadn't even risen, but the desert was already on fire. Along the U.S.-Mexico border, shadows moved like ghosts in the dusty twilight. Men, women, and children fled through dry brush and thorny cactus, their faces choked with sand, fear, and urgency. Behind them, chaos. Ahead of them, uncertainty. And above them, circling like mechanical vultures, drones buzzed, watching every twitch, every misstep. A sharp spotlight beamed down from a drone. It locked onto a young boy gripping his mother's hand. She didn't scream, she couldn't. Her breath had dried up hours ago, but her eyes screamed louder than sirens. Then sirens. Red and blue lights exploded across the ground. Border Patrol trucks skidded into framed tires, slicing through dirt like blades. Armed officers spilled out like stormtroopers. Orders were barked. Guns were drawn. Bodies hit the ground. A teenage boy darted left. A taser crackled. He fell hard. This wasn't a war zone. This was the American border, and it looked like the end of the world. The camera pans up, revealing it, the wall. Tall, ugly, gray, rust-streaked and scarred by graffiti. A billion-dollar monument to fear, a structure meant to symbolize strength-control dominance. And yet, even now, immigrants still rush through. They found gaps. They scaled it with ladders. They tunneled beneath. For every wall-built desperation found a door. And in the background, from a presidential campaign rally in Texas, a voice roared over loudspeakers like thunder. We need the wall. The wall will work, and it's going to be bigger, stronger, and more beautiful than anything you've ever seen. The crowd erupted in cheers, but the screen cuts abruptly. Silence. Total silence. The frame shifts continents. The heat remains, but the air feels different, heavier. We're not in America anymore. We're in Burkina Faso, a vast arid land where the wind doesn't just blow, it howls. The sun is merciless. The land cracked open like old skin. But here there is no wall, no drones, no billion-dollar surveillance, just a pair of boots crunching across the red dirt. A single man silhouetted against the scorched horizon walks slowly toward a ragged flag flapping weakly on a wooden pole. His back is straight, his movements calculated. He carries no briefcase, no script, just a rifle slung over his shoulder and a stare that could break glass. This is not a politician. This is Ibrahim Traoré. No one's cheering here. No one's clapping. But the tension in the air could slice a diamond, because unlike in America here, the danger doesn't come from those trying to get in. It comes from those trying to take control, foreign corporations, terrorist groups, old colonial powers, wearing modern suits. And while the United States builds physical walls to keep people out, Burkina Faso's leader is trying to keep his people from giving up on their land, their dignity, their right to exist without permission from anyone. In the distance, a plume of smoke rises, another village attacked, another boundary tested. But Traoré doesn't flinch. He watches, waits. There are no sirens here, just the quiet before a war. The screen flashes black. A single sentence appears white on black. This is not about borders. This is about survival. And then it begins, the war of ideas, the clash of empires. The young captain turned rebel, staring down centuries of foreign domination. The former real estate mogul demanding walls while his own country fractures. This is not just East versus West, North versus South. This is a collision of two worlds. And in the dust of Burkina Faso, the empire is about to be humiliated. The world looks very different from the sky. At 30,000 feet, borders are invisible. No walls, no fences, no checkpoints, just continents, oceans, and the pulse of humanity spread like veins across the earth. But somewhere in a cold, fluorescent-lit war room in Washington, a different kind of map is displayed, a glowing heat map of global instability. Bright red hotspots pulse over Ukraine, Syria, Gaza, Taiwan. Yellow glows over Somalia, Haiti, and Venezuela. Advisors murmur, generals point, journalists wait for the next headline. But buried near the bottom of the screen, almost flickering, barely detectable, is a tiny red dot in West Africa. Burkina Faso. No one mentions it. No reporter in DC brings it up. No push notification from CNN. The world is too busy, too distracted, too selective in its outrage. Yet on the ground, something is boiling. Something that doesn't show up on a satellite feed or on a sanitized evening newscast. Not yet. A nation bleeding, broken, and betrayed, but not dead. Something is moving beneath the sand. Not a riot, not a protest. A man, and not just any man. A soldier, a shadow, a match inches from the fuse. The name means little to the world for now, but in dusty markets and war-torn villages, whispers pass like contraband. Captain Traoré has returned from the front. He's not like the others. He fights with us, sleeps on the ground. He doesn't take orders from Paris. Burkina Faso, landlocked, forgotten. Once praised as a model of democracy, now crumbling under the weight of corruption, French dependency, and jihadist insurgencies. A country that's become a chessboard for distant powers. And yet in this silence, a storm is forming. In the capital, Ouagadougou, government buildings tremble from the inside. Ministers speak in hushed voices. Foreign diplomats pack bags just in case. They've seen this movie before, an African coup. Another strongman, another cycle of violence. But this one feels different. Because while America builds walls to keep people out, this man, this young steel-eyed commander, is building something else entirely. Conviction. Not made of concrete, not funded by lobbyists, not announced with red caps or Twitter rants, but grown slowly, dangerously inside the hearts of a people who have had enough. Enough of being ruled from abroad. Enough of being looted in broad daylight. Enough of being told to be grateful for aid while their children dig gold for French conglomerates. Captain Ibrahim Traoré isn't asking for permission. He isn't begging for help. He doesn't want a seat at the table. He's flipping the table over. The camera zooms in on a photo pinned to a wall. Young Traoré in fatigues kneeling beside a wounded soldier applying a tourniquet. His hands covered in blood. His face calm. He's not posing for propaganda. He didn't even know the photo was taken. This is not a man who trained for politics. He trained for war. And now, without warning, the war is coming home. Still, no one's paying attention. Not the White House. Not Brussels. Not even the African Union, too busy holding summits and sipping tea. The map says Burkina Faso is unstable, but it says nothing of the storm brewing in its soul. Soon the forgotten dot on that glowing heat map will erupt with fire. And when it does, it won't ask for your coverage. It will demand your respect. Because revolutions don't start with speeches, they start with silence. And then a decision. The heat shimmered across the horizon like a mirage trying to escape the truth. A single road, half paved, half forgotten, cut across the Sahel like a scar. Dust swirled in lazy spirals, and even the wind seemed reluctant to breathe. In the distance, a lone figure emerged from the haze. Slow, steady, unbothered by the silence that greeted him. Boots caked in red earth, his shadow stretching behind him like a flag at half-mast. A rifle rested across his shoulder, not in defiance but familiarity. His uniform was wrinkled, sun-bleached, and smeared with sweat and grit. No stars, no medals, just dust and purpose. Ibrahim Traoré. There was nothing grand about his arrival. No entourage, no fanfare, no booming speeches. He simply walked into frame, into history, as if he'd been summoned by the land itself. He was young, too young. No seasoned general's frown carved into his face. No silver hair to telegraph wisdom. In another world, at another time, he could have been mistaken for a foot soldier or a student still learning how to salute. But then you saw his eyes, and everything changed. Dark, piercing, still. They didn't just look at the world, they read through it. Like he'd already seen what was coming, like he'd been born 1 inch from the fire and had simply learned to stand still inside it. There was no swagger in his step, no practiced smile. He wasn't performing, he was watching, taking measure of everything and everyone with the patience of someone who had learned the cruel geometry of betrayal early in life. There was something quietly volatile about him, like the moment before lightning touches the earth, charge inevitable. Around him people whispered. Some stood unsure. Others saluted hesitantly. Not because they had to, but because there was something magnetic about his presence, something ancient. A presence not of politics, but of myth. This was not a general trying to impress. This was a man who knew he didn't need to. He didn't fill the silence. He owned it. The village elder approached first, his voice cracking with the weight of disbelief. "You came. They said you wouldn't." Traoré nodded once. He didn't need words. The elder reached out to shake his hand but paused, noticing the rifle. Traoré noticed too. Slowly he unslung it, leaned it against a wooden beam, and offered his bare hand. It was small, calloused, tired, but it trembled with something that couldn't be named. Here finally was someone who didn't look like a savior, didn't act like one, and perhaps didn't even want to be one. And yet, he was the only one who came. Burkina Faso didn't need another politician in a clean suit promising solutions from a safe office. It needed a man who had walked through the fire and come back with his voice still steady and his feet still moving forward. Traoré was not supposed to be here. Not at the center. Not with this kind of momentum. Not with millions watching from the shadows. But history doesn't always follow protocol. Sometimes it simply chooses a man and waits. Long before he held a rifle, Ibrahim Traoré held a stick. Barefoot, shirtless, and 8 years old, he gripped it like a weapon while standing guard outside a straw hut on the edge of his village near Bondakoué. His mission wasn't military. It was simple: protect his younger siblings from stray goats, wandering thieves, or bullies from the next village. The stick, rough and splintered, was more symbol than tool. But in a world that took everything from you, even a stick could feel like resistance. The sun ruled everything. It baked the ground into cracked red clay. It blistered skin and burned crops. Traoré's mother wore a scarf soaked in sweat as she worked in the field, her hands calloused from years of coaxing life from exhausted soil. His father, quiet, cautious, taught him to listen, more than speak, to observe the world before judging it. But even his father couldn't explain why the gold under their feet made French companies rich while their school couldn't afford chalk. At school, the books were in French. The flags on the wall weren't just Burkina Faso's, they were the tricolor of the French Republic. The lessons praised the generosity of colonial aid, the civility of the French language, the partnership between Africa and Europe. Traoré sat in the back of the classroom, hands folded tightly, jaw clenched. He was 10 when he asked a teacher, "If we are partners, why are they the ones always giving orders?" The teacher didn't answer. A week later, he was slapped for refusing to recite a poem praising France. That night, he sat outside under the stars, knees pulled to his chest, watching the wind dance across the dry grass. His mother approached quietly, laying a hand on his shoulder. "You're too serious for your age," she said. "I see too much," he replied. She said nothing more. By 12, he had memorized the names of the foreign mining companies operating within 50 kilometers of his village. He began asking questions at the market, listening to older men talk politics. He noticed which roads were repaired and which were always pending international funds. He counted the number of new trucks for the French soldiers stationed nearby and the number of days his school went without electricity. Then came the first time he saw someone beaten. It was a Friday. Dust hung thick in the air like smoke. A young man, barely 20, had been accused of agitating the community with anti-government flyers. The local police, trained by international forces, arrived in armored vehicles. They dragged him into the square and beat him in front of everyone. His screams bounced off the mud walls and got stuck in Traoré's chest like shards of glass. No one moved, not his teacher, not his father, not even the village elder. But Traoré, frozen fists clenched, heart hammering, stood his ground. He didn't know what he could do, but he knew he wouldn't forget. Later that night, with his lip trembling and fists still tight, he whispered to himself, "One day I'll carry the flag, but never bow my head." That was the beginning. Not of ambition, but of defiance. Not a dream of power, but a promise of resistance. He didn't know what path would lead him there. He didn't yet know the shape of the war. But something had ignited in him that day, not fury, not vengeance, but something colder, sharper, more enduring. Conviction. It wouldn't shout. It wouldn't shake walls. It would wait, like a shadow, like a soldier, like a boy who had seen the world's lies and decided he would spend his life undoing them. He didn't look like a soldier when he first walked into the National Military Academy in Cariogo. He looked like a boy who had learned to carry silence like armor. Slender, quiet, and unreadable, Ibrahim Traoré kept his eyes low and his mind sharp. While other recruits showed off cracked jokes or collapsed during drills, he moved like someone who had already survived a battlefield no one else could see. The academy broke most men before it built them. The sun was ruthless, the food scarce, the training relentless. But for Traoré, it felt familiar. Hunger wasn't new. Heat wasn't a punishment. And exhaustion, well, he'd grown up in a village where rest was a luxury. Here at least suffering had purpose. He trained in silence and learned in shadows. While others mastered routines, he studied tactics. He didn't just want to fire a weapon, he wanted to understand terrain, timing, deception. He devoured books on warfare, Mao, Guevara, Clausewitz, even Napoleon. Not because he idolized them, but because he knew every empire left behind its own blueprint of fear. Within 2 years, he was top of his unit in night operations, strategy simulations, and language code breaking. But Traoré didn't care for praise. He didn't smile at promotion ceremonies. He didn't drink during weekend breaks. He wasn't here for celebration. He was preparing for something bigger, something not yet visible. When he was deployed to the northern Sahel, the theory became blood. Ambushes were daily. The enemy wasn't a uniformed army, but a ghost jihadist cells trained in guerrilla warfare, hardened by desert life and funded by money no one could trace. Traoré led patrols through jagged ridges and snake-filled ravines, learning the patterns of shadows, the weight of silence before an attack. Once his unit was pinned down for 16 hours in a dry riverbed, while gunmen with superior firepower laid siege from the cliffs. The radio failed. The reinforcements never came. One of his men bled out at his feet. Another screamed until his throat went dry. Traoré crawled through the night alone, circled behind the attackers, and used nothing but a single grenade and 2 flares to make it look like a larger force had arrived. It worked. They ran. His men survived. He didn't speak of it afterward, but the battalion whispered he sees the battlefield like a map. The nickname began Le Général de Feu, the fire general. But the deeper he went into combat, the more the smoke began to clear, and what he saw turned his stomach. French intelligence officers appeared suddenly at bases, issuing advice to Burkina commanders. Airstrikes were approved or denied by Western consultants. Arms shipments arrived late or not at all. His own soldiers were ordered to escort convoys of mining trucks, not protect villages. He saw rebel leaders mysteriously escape capture, only to resurface in areas strategically inconvenient for French operations. It didn't make sense until it made too much sense. Burkina Faso wasn't just fighting terrorists. It was playing a role in a larger game, a game scripted in Paris, directed from embassies, and funded with Burkina's own blood and gold. Traoré watched commanding officers bend their spines under foreign pressure. He heard them speak with respect to colonels in crisp suits who'd never fired a weapon in their lives. He read between the lines of memos labeled classified and saw how puppets don't always know they're dancing. The day the illusion finally shattered, he was standing over the body of a 5-year-old girl killed in crossfire. Her house had been collateral damage during a French drone strike meant for a suspected insurgent vehicle. No one claimed responsibility. No one apologized. That night, sitting in the dust beside his tent, Traoré took a stick and drew a line in the ground. Then he whispered to no one, "No one fights for us, so we will fight for ourselves." It was not a declaration of war. It was something colder, a seed. It would take root in silence. It would grow in fire. And one day it would burn everything false to the ground. It happened at dawn without warning, without banners, without blood. No tanks in the streets, no rebel chants, no gunfire echoing through the capital. Just a quiet ripple through the chain of command. One general disappeared from the airwaves. Another didn't show up to morning briefing. Then a signal was sent. A phrase encrypted but unmistakable pulsed across internal radio channels. The flag remains. The throne does not. By the time the sun reached its peak, the president was under protective custody. State television was surrounded. Checkpoints were established not to fight civilians, but to prevent foreign extraction. The presidential palace was not stormed. It was walked into like a room already emptied of authority. There were no chants in the streets, no fists raised, no crowds waving flags. Only a strange collective exhale, like a country that had held its breath too long and was now afraid to believe the air had changed. In Ouagadougou, people watched their phones refreshing headlines that hadn't arrived yet. Rumors move faster than facts. The outside world blinked confused. Another coup, the pundits scoffed on international news. Just another African shuffle. But this wasn't noise. This was a scalpel. The soldiers who entered the presidential office didn't speak. They moved with quiet purpose, almost reverent, as if they weren't conquering something but cleansing it. And at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré, 34 years old, not in dress uniform, not seated behind a grand desk. He stood in a bare room with a cracked map of Burkina Faso pinned to the wall behind him. No generals flanked him. No foreign flag sat on his right. A single camera recorded him as he faced the nation, not with a speech, not with promises, but with a single sentence delivered in a voice neither loud nor soft but deliberate. We did not seize power. We reclaimed our dignity. Then silence. Not applause, not marching bands, not declarations of revolution, just a long, aching silence like the moment between lightning and thunder. In that silence, something changed. Not visibly, not instantly, but irreversibly. Some people wept, not out of joy but exhaustion. Others stayed indoors waiting wary. They'd seen false messiahs before. They'd voted. They'd hoped. They'd buried those hopes in silence and shame. But Traoré didn't ask for celebration. He didn't ride through the capital on a truck waving to the crowd. He didn't drape himself in flags or announce a new era. He ordered his troops to go home to their families, to their barracks, to stand down unless fired upon. No looting, no arrests, no retaliation. He didn't come to conquer. He came to reset the clock, to stop the bleeding, to draw a new line. And in doing so, he became something no one expected. Not just a soldier who toppled a government, but a man who knew that the hardest part wasn't taking power. It was not becoming the thing you just replaced. Burkina Faso is not poor. That's the first lie. It sits atop veins of gold so rich they could make a small kingdom. Its northern deserts conceal uranium coveted by every nuclear nation. Beneath the savannas lie rare earth metals essential to modern technology, lithium, manganese, copper. Oil deposits whisper beneath the soil, still untapped, still eyed hungrily by foreign firms. This land to the untrained eye looks dry and forgotten. But to satellite analysts in Paris and Brussels, it is glowing with profit. The wealth is not hidden, it's just extracted quietly. On paper, the French government has no colonies. That ended decades ago, they say. Yet in Burkina Faso, the influence is not printed on flags, it is stamped on contracts signed in French legalese, buried in bureaucratic subclauses that lock generations into dependency. Gold leaves in convoys escorted by foreign security. Oil rights are parceled out to European firms with exploration licenses stretching 30 years. Uranium is quietly siphoned off under the guise of strategic reserves. And what's left, dust, hunger, silence. Children starve just kilometers away from gold mines that gleam under floodlights 24 hours a day. Mothers boil rice without salt. Fathers walk 5 kilometers to draw water from wells that serve foreign contractors before villagers. In schools, chalkboards are cracked, and teachers go unpaid while their nation's riches fund retirement accounts in Marseille and corporate bonuses in Geneva. This is not just theft, it's a masterpiece of quiet domination. The French don't rule from palaces anymore. They rule from NGO boardrooms, military bases, and development grants with strings tighter than chains. They send advisors, not governors. They dress their ambassadors in tailored diplomacy and fly in humanitarian aid stamped with their flag. And while the West celebrates aid to Africa, the fine print reveals the deeper truth. For every euro sent in 10 are siphoned out. France calls it cooperation. Burkina Faso calls it bleeding behind a handshake. NATO plays its part too. Surveillance drones patrol the Sahel, not to protect villagers, but to protect European mining zones. Western intelligence shares satellite data with French operators, but not with Burkinabe field units. Every time Traoré's forces request information on insurgent movements, there's a delay, a blackout, a bureaucratic shrug. It's as if someone wants the fire to keep burning, just not too close to the gold. The insurgency. Yes, it's real. Jihadists roam, terrorize, and kill. But the battlefield is not only a fight of ideology, it's a chessboard of economic geography. The terror thrives most where the resources lie deepest, and oddly it always seems to spread near zones where foreign contracts are in dispute. Coincidence? Traoré doesn't think so. He once told a village elder after inspecting a burnt schoolhouse near a French mining operation, "They don't see schools. They see gold. We see graves. They see growth." That's the calculus. That's the shadow in the sand. Even French troops stationed for security rarely protect civilians. They protect infrastructure contracts, profit routes. And when asked to assist in village defense, they reply that it's not within the mission mandate. Traoré has stood in those meetings. He has seen the maps. He knows which villages will be ignored next and why. This is not a forgotten war. It is a managed fire. And in that fire, a nation is cooked slowly, so slowly that the outside world calls it normal. Burkina Faso was not colonized again with ships and guns. It was colonized through silent signatures and spreadsheets. The old empire may have changed its flag, but it never gave up its appetite. And Traoré, now standing at the center of it all, doesn't just see the shadow, he intends to burn it out of the sand. The room was not large, but it felt suffocating. Thick carpets, heavy curtains, a chandelier that didn't belong in a country still begging for mosquito nets. The air conditioning hummed softly, an imported hum foreign even in its comfort. Outside, the midday heat scorched Ouagadougou, but inside this quiet diplomatic residence, the war was fought with smiles and subtle threats. 3 men sat across from Ibrahim Traoré at a narrow table of polished wood. French suits, silk ties, laptops, closed pens uncapped. Their posture casual but eyes calculating. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even politicians, really. They were envoys, technocrats, trained in negotiation, backed by intelligence, fluent in 5 languages, and experts in saying dangerous things softly. One began, his voice like honey laced with arsenic. "We understand your frustration, Captain. Truly, the situation in the Sahel is delicate, but international cooperation is the only path forward. We offer aid, training, logistical support. All we ask is continuity, stability, no sudden shifts." Traoré didn't blink. He already knew what this was. It wasn't a conversation. It was a warning dressed as a favor. The second diplomat leaned in, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his cuff. "There's concern in Paris. Your recent rhetoric cutting ties with our military, revisiting mining contracts, it sends the wrong message. Investors are nervous. Sanctions could be unfortunate. For your people." There it was. The whisper. Not loud, not cruel, just precise. A reminder that power doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it simply taps you on the shoulder while smiling. Traoré let the silence hang. He wanted them to sweat in it even a little. Then the third one, older, more confident, spoke the line they had all been circling around. "You don't bite the hand that feeds you." He said it as if it were fact, as if gravity itself agreed. Traoré looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with something colder, clarity. He leaned forward slowly, his voice low, flat, deliberate. "We didn't ask you to feed us." The words landed like a stone through stained glass. None of the envoys replied immediately. For a brief moment, the only sound was the hum of the imported air conditioner. Traoré continued, "We had land, water, gold. Before your banks, before your maps, before your embassies told us how to govern. What you fed us was debt, dependency. You carved our dignity into contracts, and now you want gratitude?" His stare didn't move. "You fed yourselves. Through us." One of the envoys shifted posture, tightening mask, slipping for a second. But Traoré wasn't finished. "You say sanctions will hurt the people. They already hurt. Every time you fly gold out while our schools collapse. Every time you delay a weapons shipment while villages burn. Don't talk to me about the people." A pause, a breath. "If you want to leave, go. And if you want war, make it. But don't pretend you're still welcome here." The men stood slowly, gathering their papers without a word. No handshakes, no smiles. Just tight nods and the subtle click of leather briefcases snapping shut. When they were gone, Traoré remained seated. He didn't feel victorious. He felt cleaner. He had said what no one else had dared to say, not just to the French, but to every government that believed Africa still came with a leash. and he had done it without raising his voice. Later that week, France froze development funds. Military cooperation was reevaluated. Rumors swirled of covert retaliation, economic sabotage, planted stories foreign-backed unrest. It didn't matter. A line had been drawn not in ink, not in sand, but in will. For decades, the colonizer had whispered in Africa's ear, "Be quiet, be grateful, obey." Now someone had whispered back, "No," and that whisper would echo louder than any speech. It didn't begin with gunfire. It began with a letter, official, stark, delivered by hand to the French embassy in Ouagadougou. It contained a single declaration dated and stamped: "All military accords between Burkina Faso and the French Republic are hereby nullified effective immediately." No fanfare, no press conference, no dramatic speech. Just a document and the kind of silence that comes before thunder. Within hours, the ripples hit Paris. Phones lit up, advisors scrambled. Editorial desks sharpened their knives. The French Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a formal concern. NATO regretted the decision. Think tanks called it a leap into chaos. The word reckless was repeated so many times it became its own headline. But on the ground in Burkina Faso, something different was happening. Young men walked through the capital waving hand-painted signs: "France dégage, France get out." Market vendors turned up radios to hear the announcement again, disbelieving. Elders gathered under trees and said quiet prayers, not for war, but for clarity. Children listened wide-eyed to fathers who spoke of the past, with voices that cracked when they said, "We never thought we'd see this." And the soldiers, they didn't cheer. They didn't riot. They simply exhaled, because they'd spent too long fighting two wars, one against insurgents and one against silence. Now at least the silence was broken. Within 72 hours, French forces were told to vacate their bases. No exceptions. Helicopters no longer had airspace privileges. Surveillance drones were grounded. Joint operations were suspended. Official maps were redrawn. What had once been politely called cooperation was now rebranded truthfully as eviction. There were no riots in the streets. There was no looting of embassies. There was only an unmistakable sense the empire had been told to leave. Global media spun it like a crisis. Editorials ran with phrases like neo-authoritarianism and nationalist populism. Talking heads in New York and London warned of a power vacuum. They asked smugly who would fill it. The people didn't care, because for the first time in decades, someone had pulled the plug, cut the cord, burned the old contract, and Traoré, calm, unreadable, simply said to his cabinet, "Let them call it reckless. We call it breathing." Foreign diplomats packed their bags. Military advisors slipped away quietly. And in the early morning haze, one last French convoy rolled through the gates of their base, past a small crowd of villagers, watching silently, some with folded arms, others with subtle nods. No one threw stones. No one waved. Just a collective gaze that said, "We are watching, and we remember." The French flag came down. It folded in on itself as it was lowered, almost embarrassed. Burkina Faso was not yet free from struggle, but it was no longer occupied by illusion. And sometimes the first act of liberation is not a revolution, not a battle, not a slogan. Sometimes it's just telling someone to leave and meaning it. No manuals, no funding, no foreign support. This was the army Traoré inherited. The moment French troops left, so did the illusion of structure. Warehouses were bare. Equipment was outdated, malfunctioning, or missing entirely. Files had been wiped. Radios jammed. What remained was a hollowed-out force, demoralized, underfed, half-trained, and surrounded by enemies on all sides. And yet he didn't flinch, because Ibrahim Traoré had never expected help. He had already begun preparing before the coup ever happened. In secret, he'd mapped out the skeletal remains of Burkina's military landscape. What equipment still worked? Which commanders were loyal? Which villages were ready to fight? He'd identified smugglers willing to trade weapons for grain, for ore, for silence. Deals made in whispers, not treaties. Shipments routed through Mali and Niger, hidden under livestock, smuggled across rivers on rafts under moonlight. Nothing was legal, nothing was clean, but it worked. He didn't rebuild an army, he resurrected it. In the northern provinces, where government presence had long since vanished, Traoré's forces returned, not with polished uniforms but with questions. What do you need? Who is attacking you? What do you have to defend yourselves? The answers came in calloused hands and wary stares. We have sticks, one elder said, and anger. That was enough. Training began at dawn, not in academies or formal camps, but in abandoned fields, burnt-out schools, and goat pens converted into firing ranges. Soldiers trained farmers. Former rebels trained volunteers. Women stood alongside men. Children learned to signal with mirrors and smuggled walkie-talkies. They used sticks for rifles, painted lines in dirt for borders, practiced urban defense by running barefoot through old market stalls. They watched drone footage shared over Telegram, grainy, jumpy, but enough to spot movement, enough to learn patterns. Instructors rewound the same 5 seconds of an insurgent ambush over and over, pointing out how fighters approached from wind direction, how they retreated uphill, how they camouflaged with foliage. This was war without the West. No satellites, no air cover, no Geneva Conventions. Just dust instinct and adaptation. Traoré's strategy wasn't about overpowering the enemy. It was about outlasting them. He ordered local militias to disappear into terrain, to fight only when necessary, to scatter when outnumbered. He instructed villages to build false supply routes, decoys to draw fire away from real stores. At night, they used mirrors to reflect the moon toward would-be attackers, tricking them into thinking reinforcements were arriving. And at the center of this effort, unshaven and unshowered, always moving between fronts, was Traoré himself. He slept in tents, shared meals from communal pots, attended funerals not as a leader, but as a brother in arms. His boots were always dirty, his sleeves always rolled. He carried his rifle slung low, not for ceremony, but because it was still needed. He issued no official doctrine, no strategic white papers. He simply repeated the same phrase to every recruit, every elder, every trembling hand clutching a training stick. We don't need perfect. We need prepared. Word spread. Villages once too afraid to speak now sent scouts offering support. Old rebels laid down arms to fight under a new flag. Radios crackled with reports of victories, small but growing. Checkpoints held. Ambushes failed. Convoys pushed through routes long considered dead. From the outside, international media saw chaos. From within, a pattern was forming. A rhythm. A movement. It didn't look like an army. It looked like a revolution with uniforms stitched from torn cloth, fueled by belief alone. There were no blueprints. Just one man walking through fire and thousands following with sticks in hand, waiting to turn them into rifles, waiting to turn survival into strategy. This wasn't about retaking territory. It was about reclaiming a will to fight and making the land itself part of the defense. He didn't need speeches. He had dust on his face and sleep in his eyes. That was enough. After the French were gone, after the contracts were torn, and the uniforms faded under the sun, Traoré went to the villages, not as a president, not as a general, but as a man with a purpose. No motorcade, no podium. Just an old truck, a small escort, and a satchel filled with maps and bandages. He visited places no minister had seen in decades. Villages erased from government databases. Communities marked lost by foreign agencies. Some could no longer even remember what a flag looked like. But they remembered what it meant to be hunted by terrorists, by hunger, by silence. And then without warning, he would arrive, stepping down from a dusty vehicle, carrying his own bag, sleeping on mats, eating from clay bowls. He sat with mothers who had buried sons, with elders who hadn't seen a soldier who listened in years. He didn't promise security. He didn't preach strategy. He just asked, "What do you need?" And then he stayed. He stayed when the sun vanished and the gunfire started. He slept next to his men under mosquito nets patched with duct tape. He stood watch when others rested. He helped patch wounds, carry water, dig trenches. No camera crews, no PR team. Just one leader who refused to rule from a distance. Words spread like wildfire. He wasn't like the others. He didn't dress for television. He didn't vanish after a photo op. He didn't hide behind technical challenges. He showed up with a rifle and notepad and a face that had seen what theirs had. Then came the radio broadcasts. Crackling through old transistor sets and solar-powered receivers, Traoré's voice cut through static like thunder through dust. Don't run. Fight. This land is your child. Would you abandon your own child in the night? In another, his voice was soft, nearly a whisper. They want you afraid. They want you small. But this land remembers your footsteps. It remembers who belongs. These weren't official addresses. They weren't polished or written by speechwriters. They were unscripted, raw, and real. Some were recorded under trees. Others were phoned in from battle zones. But every word felt like it was being spoken across a campfire to a single listener, intimate, urgent, impossible to ignore. And the people answered. Recruitment centers were flooded not with professional soldiers, but farmers, welders, students, mothers. Young girls offered to carry supplies. Elders volunteered to teach first aid. Entire villages mobilized not under orders, but under belief. In one village, a group of widows formed a scout unit armed with whistles, mirrors, and grit. They called themselves the Daughters of Resistance. In another, a teenage boy offered his motorbike to ferry messages between outposts through ambush zones, through curfews without hesitation. They didn't call it conscription. They called it defending home. Traoré visited each new unit personally when he could, shook every hand, learned every name. He didn't speak of glory. He spoke of duty memory, the simple power of refusing to give up. He said this war is not about weapons. It's about who refuses to disappear. By month's end, enlistment tripled. Drone operators were being trained in old barns. Tactical teams formed from fishermen and butchers. Morale didn't just rise, it roared. Traoré's commanders didn't understand it at first. The numbers made no sense. The math was impossible. No money, no global backing, just momentum. But then one soldier said it simply, he doesn't lead from above. He walks next to us. And that was the secret. He didn't build a military. He lit a fuse in the soul of a forgotten people. And when hearts catch fire, guns become secondary. The bullets never worried him. It was the whispers that did. By the time Ibrahim Traoré had rallied the countryside and turned rice farmers into resistance cells, not every enemy wore a beard or carried a black flag. Some wore tailored suits, sat in air-conditioned offices, and toasted to foreign contracts under flickering lights in private villas. The empire may have left, but its fingerprints remained. Within the capital, pro-French elites whispered over imported wine. Ministers who had survived every regime change began to plot again. Men who'd lost power didn't mourn it. They tried to buy it back. Not with votes, but with dollars wired through untraceable channels. Promises of stability whispered into the ears of those tired of fighting. Traoré's inner circle began to shrink, not from purges, but from doubt. He saw the hesitations in briefings, the sideways glances in strategy, meetings, the sudden resignations for family reasons. Information leaked. Convoy routes were compromised. Villages once secure were ambushed within hours of receiving new supplies. Someone was feeding the enemy. But he didn't flinch. He changed nothing except his vigilance. Until one night the betrayal arrived, not as rumor, but as a trigger pull. It was a meeting like any other. A remote outpost. A circle of commanders. A single light bulb swinging overhead. Traoré stood over a map when the gun clicked behind him, except it never fired. Because in that exact second, a farmer barefoot carrying a basket of cassava lunged out of the dark and tackled the would-be assassin to the ground. The pistol skittered across the dirt. Shouts erupted. Boots stomped. The traitor was pinned. The man who saved Traoré wasn't a soldier. He was a villager who delivered vegetables to the outpost for weeks. He'd overheard a phone call. He'd seen the wrong handshake. He had acted without orders, without hesitation. When asked why, he simply said, "You're the first one who sat on the ground and ate with us." I wasn't about to lose that. Traoré didn't speak. He just nodded and handed the man his own dagger engraved with the national seal. From that night on, the myth began. People didn't just fight for him, they protected him. Women stood watch outside buildings he entered. Children ran messages ahead to check for danger. Entire villages volunteered to test roads for ambushes before his motorcade passed. They called him Le Silencieux, the Silent One. Not because he didn't speak, but because he didn't brag. Because while others plotted behind closed doors, he stayed in the open. Because while enemies whispered in corners, he walked straight through the fire. And now those who tried to kill him found something more terrifying than a bullet. They couldn't stop the idea of him, not with sabotage, not with gold, not even with death. The man had become something else, a symbol, and symbols once lit don't die in the dark. The hall was colder than expected, not by temperature but by tone, marble floors, steel security, polished accents, polished harder than the wood of the podium. The United Nations General Assembly always carried an air of timeless theater. Rows of ambassadors in tailored suits, translation headsets humming like an invisible choir, eyes shifting between notes and screens, nods, practiced applause measured. New York. Power dressed in silence. The screens flickered with archived footage. Trump in 2017 raising eyebrows as he bellowed about sovereignty, then boasting of military might like a king showing off cannons. Biden in 2021, gentler in tone, but firm in positioning, promising partnership, security, democracy. The camera zoomed in on Macron the following year, rolling ERRs and championing shared values, while sidestepping the word colonialism like it was a live grenade. Each man had stood at this podium and made their pitch. And now came a man who didn't want the stage but had earned it through blood, betrayal, and silence. Ibrahim Traoré walked into the chamber, not in a designer suit but in pressed fatigues. No flag pin, no French cufflinks, no notes in hand. Just a folded piece of paper and eyes that had seen children buried, villages burned, soldiers bled dry beneath drone shadows. Delegates glanced. Some frowned. Others smiled politely. A few tapped screens to confirm his name. Burkina Faso was never meant to be on this stage, but now he was here. He stood behind the podium. No teleprompter, no diplomatic grace, just presence. His first words were like stone breaking glass. You fed us crumbs and expected gratitude. The room shifted, heads turned, earpieces clicked into translation mode. He continued, his tone low, deliberate cutting without raising volume. You held up coins like offerings, but we knew what they were, tips for silence. And for decades we were silent. We died silent. We begged silent. But something happened. We remembered how to bake. The French delegation stiffened. The U.S. rep leaned forward. Macron, seated in the second row, smiled with his mouth and not his eyes. We no longer need crumbs, Traoré said. We've learned to use the fire you left behind to feed ourselves. We've turned charity into revolution, dependence into defiance. A flicker of tension pulsed through the room like a fault line yawning beneath marble. You speak of peace, but where were your peacekeepers when the mines exploded? You speak of rights, but who trains the men who train our killers? You call it aid, we call it interest. At the edge of the chamber, a few delegates clapped briefly, nervously. Others remained stone-faced. Traoré didn't pause. He wasn't looking for applause. You sent soldiers to protect your investments. You sent NGOs to monitor our wounds. You sent cameras for our pain, never for our joy. And when we stood up, you said, "How dare you forget your place?" Now he looked directly at Macron. We have not forgotten our place. We've just decided you're not in it anymore. Silence. The kind of silence that fills a church after a blasphemy and lingers because no one knows if it was holy after all. Traoré stepped back. No dramatic exit, no final flourish. He folded the paper in his hand, still untouched, and walked off the stage. He didn't wait for the media to spin it. He didn't wait for diplomats to interpret it. He didn't need to, because the message had been sent, not just to governments, not just to institutions, but to every small country, every silenced people, every movement told they were too poor, too late, too unimportant to matter. And from that moment on, Traoré was no longer just a regional leader. He had become something else entirely, a global disruption in human form. The applause hadn't even faded from the marble hall before the backlash began. By the time Ibrahim Traoré boarded his return flight to Ouagadougou, the warnings had already turned to action. European financial networks flagged accounts linked to Burkina Faso's central bank. Frozen. Aid packages were delayed for review. Visas revoked. A quiet but coordinated squeeze, not through bombs or tanks, but through bankers' hands and bureaucrats' pens. The headlines followed like wolves. A dangerous populist in uniform. The Guardian. The African Chavez. Politico, Burkina Faso's reckless break from the West. Le Monde instability in the Sahel, Traoré's gamble. The Economist, photos of him in military fatigues were framed ominously, always with shadows, always with phrases like militant nationalist or the favorite word of empire. When it feels threatened, strongman. Western think tanks published white papers overnight, warning of authoritarian drift. Talk shows filled airtime debating whether Traoré was too radical, anti-democratic, or destabilizing African unity. Old video clips were dug up, edited out of context, twisted into narratives of paranoia or aggression. They weren't trying to destroy him physically. They were trying to erase his legitimacy. But something happened that no analyst, no strategist, no speechwriter could predict. The streets answered, not just in Burkina Faso, but in Bamako, in Niamey, in Kinshasa, and Dakar. First it was a few hundred students, then thousands, then waves. Massive rallies swelled across Africa, uncoordinated, but strangely synchronized like drums beating across the continent from village to village. Protesters held signs scrawled with emotion, not polish. Hand-painted slogans, faces painted in flag colors. Drums, chants, barefoot children sitting on shoulders yelling louder than microphones could carry. No to puppets, yes to patriots. Je suis Traoré, we are not your minerals. One image went viral, a little girl in a torn school uniform standing on a red dirt road holding a cardboard sign that read, "Our soil, our rules." Another photo, this one taken from above, showed a sea of people gathered in the capital of Mali, forming a human mosaic spelling out, "Africa is rising." Governments wavered. Some denounced the protests. Others remained quiet, suddenly unsure of their alignment. Leaders who once ignored Traoré now whispered his name behind closed doors. In Africa's younger generation, he was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol, not of Burkina Faso, not even of revolution, but of dignity, of self-definition, of the refusal to be someone else's line on a spreadsheet. The West scoffed. They said it would fade, but it didn't. More banks tried to freeze assets, but local markets adjusted. Farmers traded in food, citizens donated coins, militias shared supplies, engineers built workarounds for fuel blockades. On encrypted apps, young coders began building alternative communication networks, peer-to-peer systems, to bypass media blackouts. They didn't wait for permission, they moved. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traoré remained calm. No rebuttals, no press tours, no attempts to appease. In his only public comment during the backlash, he said, "You cannot freeze a people's will. We have already paid in blood. Your sanctions are late." At night, he walked alone through his compound's gardens, lit only by moonlight and the quiet hum of distant generators. He knew this wasn't just about foreign pressure. It was a test of whether the will of a people could outlast the pressure of an empire. And somehow, day by day, it seemed like it could. Because while the world tried to bury the idea kept breathing. It took root in young musicians writing protest songs, in market women refusing to sell imported rice, in teachers rewriting history lessons by candlelight, in children who now knew the name Traoré before they knew any president who came before him. The empire had tried to define him. The people had already decided. The village had no electricity. The sky was already turning amber, the kind of warm dusk that sinks slowly into the red soil and rests gently on thatched roofs. Chickens clucked. Someone coughed in the distance. A pot boiled over an open fire. Children chased dust devils down a footpath that led nowhere but home. There was no television here, no satellite dish, no 4G signal, but there was a radio. It sat on a wooden crate in the center of the square, battered and taped at the edges, the kind of machine that had outlived governments and generations. Its antenna was a bent wire, its battery powered by a solar panel salvaged from a rusted roadside sign. As the sky darkened, the radio crackled. Static hissed. Then a voice, familiar, measured, calm but carrying the weight of thunder behind every word. Brothers, sisters, the world has many walls. Pause, they build them with money, with fear, with permission. Pause again. But ours is different. Our wall is not made of bricks. It is built of blood. The village stilled. No one moved. A mother hushed her baby with one hand and held the other to her chest. An elder stood straighter. The children stopped chasing shadows. Even the chickens fell silent as if the land itself was listening. We do not fight to impress. We do not kneel to survive. We do not ask for peace to be handed to us. We earn it with our bodies, our silence, our refusal to vanish. And then the final line, soft, nearly a whisper, but somehow louder than a stadium roar. They may not see us. but they will remember us. No music followed, no announcer, no applause. Just a quiet click, the broadcast ending. The air impossibly felt thicker, but no one clapped. No one cheered. They simply stood, some with heads bowed, others with fists curled at their sides. Eyes glistened, not from sadness, but from recognition. Because in that moment, Traoré wasn't a president or a soldier. He was a mirror, and in his voice they heard something ancient, something unspoken, long buried beneath years of lies, handouts, and humiliation. Dignity. No fireworks lit the sky, no horns blared. Just quiet reverence, as if the entire village had stepped into sacred ground. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. One old man, nearly blind, leaned on his cane and whispered, "We're not waiting anymore." His granddaughter, no older than 9, stood next to him, with a slingshot tucked into her waistband. She didn't speak. She just stared at the radio, eyes wide as if she'd just witnessed something holy. And maybe she had. Because real power doesn't need to scream. It doesn't beg. It doesn't shake the earth. Sometimes it simply stands and waits for the world to catch up. It began in a tent. No cameras, no diplomats, no white tablecloths or branded placards. Just 3 men seated around a wooden crate with a map spread across it, folded, stained, burned at the edges from too many years of conflict. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. 3 nations long, treated as corridors for foreign interests, as pawns in someone else's game. 3 governments who had within months of each other severed ties with France, pushed back against ECOWAS, and declared they would no longer obey instructions from the West. And now they weren't just resisting, they were organizing. The ink dried faster than the outside world believed it would. The agreement was simple, almost brutal in its clarity. A joint military pact. An attack on one would be considered an attack on all. Intelligence would be shared. Weapons would be pooled. Strategy would be unified. There would be no middlemen, no approval from Brussels or Washington, no advisory boards or capacity building from NGOs. They called it the Sahel Confederation, but it wasn't a name that mattered. It was the reality that terrified the world. Because for the first time in post-colonial African history, a regional alliance had been formed without Western architects in the room. Within weeks, construction began on the first joint military base, entirely funded, staffed, and built by Africans. Materials were locally sourced. Engineers worked under moonlight. Volunteers from across all 3 nations dug trenches, poured concrete, and cooked for the soldiers. There were no foreign flags flying, no multinational logos on the walls. Just the flags of 3 nations and a slogan painted in black across the entrance gate. Not occupation, cooperation. It wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. The base was placed near the tri-border zone, long considered ungovernable, a lawless stretch plagued by smuggling routes, terrorist camps, and abandoned promises. Now it was the epicenter of something new. Traoré stood at the edge of the site on opening day. No grand ceremony, just a small crowd of engineers, farmers, and young men in mismatched fatigues who saluted with cracked hands and tired eyes. He didn't give a speech. He just walked past them, placed his hand on the gate and whispered, "We've stopped asking. We've started building." The world noticed, not immediately and not officially, but somewhere in Langley, a leaked memo reached the wrong inbox and then the right journalist. "This is dangerous. It may spread." The phrase was scribbled in the margin beside an internal CIA briefing. The subject, the Sahel Pact and regional fragmentation risk. The memo outlined worst-case scenarios, not of war, but of inspiration, that others might follow. That other African nations might reject Western military presence, kick out foreign investors, nationalize resources, or, worse, realize they don't need permission to govern themselves. France moved quickly. Diplomatic pressure hardened. Secret envoys returned to old channels. And when diplomacy failed, the shadows moved in. Suddenly, blackouts spread across Nigerian cities. Malian supply routes mysteriously collapsed. Burkina grain shipments were intercepted at the border by unknown assailants. Rumors of civil unrest fueled by anonymous social media accounts spiked in villages that had never used Twitter before. France denied involvement. But the pattern was familiar. Behind closed doors, ECOWAS leaders, pressured by the West, began drafting resolutions for regional stabilization. the soft language of hard intervention. Whispers of a joint military response emerged. Ghana spoke loudly, Nigeria louder, but the Confederation didn't flinch. They issued a joint communiqué. We are not rebels. We are sovereign. You cannot stabilize what you never helped us secure. Traoré, when asked about the threat, simply said, "We know the difference between diplomacy and daggers." And then across radio waves he spoke again, not to presidents but to people. They will say we are unstable, but they are only afraid we've stopped being obedient. The base continued to rise, and so did the movement. The tanks never came, the jets never launched, but the pressure never stopped. Weeks turned to months and the Sahel Confederation was tested like a wound exposed to wind. Fuel became scarce, medicine scarcer. Western-backed contractors pulled out of development projects overnight. Border economies shriveled, and yet the line held. In the countryside, people returned to older systems. Barter replaced cash. Bicycles replaced trucks. Schools reopened under trees. Clinics were stocked by caravans, not convoys. Volunteers dug trenches. Engineers rewired irrigation. Farmers with no military training learned to use walkie-talkies and build barricades. In cities, youth patrols protected water stations. In villages, children were taught emergency drills instead of hymns. They didn't ask for NATO. They didn't need Paris. They had each other. Traoré's soldiers shared their food rations with civilians. Commanders walked on foot instead of taking vehicles. Messages were spread not through social media, but through runners' radios and messengers on horseback. And through it all, one phrase echoed louder than any decree. We have nothing, so we fear nothing. It was written in chalk on school walls, scratched into tree trunks, whispered by mothers to children at night. It wasn't resignation, it was liberation, because fear loses its grip when the worst has already happened and you're still standing. One reporter smuggled into a Sahel border town under false documents, filed a story that stunned readers. They have no planes, no tanks, no NATO codes, but they have willpower. And that may be the most dangerous weapon in the world. The base remained operational, the pact remained signed, and Traoré, horse unshaven eyes bloodshot from another night without sleep, stood before a group of new recruits, most wearing sandals, some no shoes at all. He looked at them and said, "They thought we were too small to matter. They were wrong." And from that day forward, no one stood alone in the Sahel, because unity had become stronger than bullets. And even empires hesitate before marching into fire they cannot understand. The sun hung low over the Sahel, casting long shadows across the dry earth. There were no speeches that day, no cameras, no podium. Just a small convoy stopping in silence at a clearing near Jibo, a field that had become a grave. It wasn't marked by stone, only shallow mounds where dozens of men, women, and children had been buried after a terrorist raid years before, forgotten by the world, unnamed in the papers, but not to Traoré. He walked alone, boots heavy with dust, face still and unreadable. His officers remained behind. This was not a battlefield. This was where the war began. He knelt slowly, no prayer, just presence. Then from his side, he pulled a folded national flag, creased, weathered, faded at the edges. He pressed it into the dirt with his bare hands, not like a symbol of conquest, like an offering. "This is where our revolution began," he whispered, "not in power, but in pain." The wind didn't blow, the air didn't move, but something deeper shifted, because sometimes truth doesn't roar. It just sits in the dust and waits to be seen. 1 year passed, not peace, but stability, raw, fragile, real. The migration slowed. Where once families lined up for buses out of the country, now they stayed. The roads weren't safer, but the land had become theirs again. Schools reopened, not in perfect buildings, but under trees with chalkboards nailed to wood. Teachers returned, many unpaid but determined. Desks were filled with children again. Some still carried trauma, others carried notebooks made from scraps. But they sat, and they learned. Markets buzzed with life. Small stalls appeared, soap makers, repairmen, farmers selling 3 eggs at a time. Women organized cooperatives. Old men fixed radios. The economy wasn't rich, but it breathed. In a village north of Kaya, a mother told a local journalist, "We used to run. Now we teach our sons to defend." That was the difference. Not wealth, not modernity, but rootedness. No one knew how long it would last, but for the first time people planned for the future because they believed they might have one. It was near sunset when the interview took place. There was no podium, no official guard detail. Just Traoré sitting on a wooden bench beside a small rural school, his uniform dusty, his boots worn, his posture relaxed but watchful. A few children played in the distance, their laughter soft in the wind. The journalist, a young Burkinabe with a notepad and a recorder, asked gently, "What happens if you fall?" "If something happens to you," Traoré didn't answer right away. He looked at the horizon for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "If I fall tomorrow, let this spirit remain." He didn't explain what he meant. He didn't have to, because by now it was clear this was never about him. It was about something larger, a movement, a memory, a refusal to stay silent. He stood up, shook the journalist's hand, and walked back toward the school where chalk dust still lingered in the air, and tomorrow's lesson plan sat half-written on a cracked blackboard. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Across the land, people were already standing in his place. There's something profoundly powerful about a person who chooses dignity over fear, especially when the world expects them to stay silent. Ibrahim Traoré's journey isn't just a tale of political resistance or military defiance. It's the story of a young man who dared to believe that even the most forgotten voices can shake the foundations of power. He didn't come with billion-dollar backing or elite alliances. He came with conviction, clarity, and the courage to say, "Enough." In a world where headlines are often dominated by the loudest voices, Traoré's rise reminds us that real change doesn't always begin in palaces or parliaments. Sometimes it starts in the dust with someone who kneels beside a grave, not to mourn what's been lost, but to promise what will never be taken again. His story challenges the old assumption that power only belongs to the wealthy, the connected, or the historically dominant. It asks us to look again at ourselves, at our communities, at what we're willing to stand for. This is not about glorifying one man. It's about recognizing what happens when someone decides to stop bowing their head, and what happens when others start standing with him. Question for the audience. Have you ever witnessed someone rise when the world expected them to fall? What did it teach you about courage and about yourself? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice matters more than you think. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.